Good afternoon, everybody. It's wonderful to see you this afternoon. I can see lots of colleagues from around the university joining us on this call. That's fantastic. I'm just going to give people one more minute to join us, and then we will get started. There's quite a few people joining in now. Welcome. I can see some familiar names, some new names. Always a pleasure to see you. And of course, we're joined by three amazing guests who are going to speak about their experience as well in this space. Is that about everyone, Lachlan?
Give it another 30 seconds, I'm thinking.
Okay. So in case you're wondering which session it was that you've signed up for, it's all about developing a compelling account of your practice and impact in learning and teaching. That's what we're here to have a conversation about. And it's for anybody, anyone who's thinking about doing, creating a compelling teaching and learning narrative for the purpose of promotion, probation, for a teaching fellowship. It could be for a teaching award. It could be for peer review, or even for your reflective teaching portfolio. So really, it's a very inclusive session, and it is meant to set you up for success in terms of thinking about what does a compelling narrative look like. And like I say, the best part of this session will be hearing from our guests, Rachel, Jess, and Anna, about how they've done that in the context of their own journey in this space. So I'm so delighted that you've joined us, and also for our guests for joining us and really being very generous in sharing their insights. So I want to start by acknowledging country. I want to acknowledge that I'm joining you from the lands of the Biripi people in this virtual space. I acknowledge the traditional custodians of all the lands on which we are situated on and which we're joining this meeting from today. Please share the nation that you're on today in the chat. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to celebrate the rich cultural diversity of all First Nations people here today. So please feel free to use the chat to say which country you're on. Thank you, Eleanor. Biripi country, wonderful. It's a lovely day out here, and we're enjoying a bit of sun, aren't we? So we're going to keep it quite simple. There's three things that we'll do. I will set the scene. I'll talk a little bit about what do we mean by influence and impact in learning and teaching, and then talk about what does a compelling narrative of influence and impact in learning and teaching look like. So that will take about 10 minutes, and then I will hand over to our guests, who will each in turn reflect on how they've gone about this process of constructing a compelling account of their teaching and learning influence and impact. And then hopefully we'll have lots of time for questions and conversations and reflections. So let's get started. So the first question I've been asking myself is, what do we mean by impact and influence in learning and teaching? Well, it depends. It depends on who you ask. So you can see that the very busy slide I've got up here, but these are just three different areas in which we talk about learning and teaching impact and influence. The first one is from the context of the Charles Sturt promotions process, which talks about a number of teaching achievements, which are then further delineated according to academic level. And so meaning that there is a trajectory of impact and influence. So for those of you who are thinking about applying for promotion, who have been recently promoted, you would have engaged with these teaching achievements, and you would have thought about, how does that apply to what I do in my school, in my faculty, and so forth. So there's one example. Then, for those of you who have engaged with us around peer review, you would have come across the Teaching Capabilities Framework. The Teaching Capabilities Framework, once again, highlights 12 areas in which we're kind of focusing on when we think about somebody's contribution and engagement and impact in learning and teaching. And if you go to the Teaching Capabilities Framework, you will also see that these capabilities are delineated according to different academic levels. So once again, there's a trajectory and a progression. So that's another framework. There you go, and different words. And then for those who have engaged with the Executive Dean's Teaching Awards, those of you who have engaged with national teaching awards like AAUT, which is the Australian Awards for University Teaching, you can see that there are other words that we're using to talk about what does impact look like. Now, there's only 4 here compared to the long lists for the other 2, and they're very defined. And in this case, with those teaching awards, everyone is subject to the same criteria. So there isn't a sense of progression and trajectory necessarily. But this is just a very quick example to highlight that there's a lot of noise in the system. And as you engage in this process of thinking about what is my impact and influence, you've really got to think about the context in which you're doing this. So the good news is that even though there are different frameworks, different criteria, and lots of different words used to conceptualize impact and influence, there are a lot of similarities. So that's the good news, right? You can kind of distill it essentially into some key areas. So I've shared this resource. It's called Spheres of Impact, and it's one of the resources that I personally find really useful when I think about my own impact and influence in learning and teaching. And that visual is really useful because it really helps you understand how we often start with thinking about how we are as an effective teacher with an impact on our students. And then we kind of move through that process where we're starting to really expand out our impact on academic colleagues, on our discipline, on our institution, and then finally at that national and international level. So I have shared the link here, and it will be in the slide deck as well. But I like this resource because it helps me to conceptualize what should I be thinking about and how should I be thinking about my own impact and influence, and what are the kind of trajectory and what is the progression that I'm expected to be showing in this space. Now, that's important from a promotions perspective, but of course, as we spoke about teaching awards and teaching fellowships, it doesn't matter how senior or junior you are subject to the same kind of assessment criteria. So here's a resource that you can engage with, I think, and particularly useful for those who are thinking about promotion, and I guess for anyone who's really thinking about where am I in my career at the moment right now, and where do I want to go to, and what are the expectations on me to demonstrate my impact and influence. So I'm sharing that with you for your use and reference later on. Now, the next question is, well, what does a compelling narrative actually look like? What does it mean to write this narrative about my impact and influence? And I think we can all say, and hopefully our guests will speak to this as well, is that there is a bit of an art and a science to this. And, there isn't really a recipe approach, and you've really got to think about the context. You've got to think about the audience you're writing for. You've got to think about your areas of strength. You've really got to think about, that context becomes really important. And we also need to understand, obviously, and be aware of the various frameworks and criteria in this space. So although the advice and guidance that you will see around the place will be expressed in many different words, much like the frameworks and criteria, there are lots of different things. There are probably 3 main things that a compelling account of practice does. So I'll cover those 3 main things, and then I'm going to hand over to Rachel as our first speaker, just to take us through her journey of constructing her compelling narrative of impact and influence. So let's go to the first one. So the first thing that a compelling account of practice does is it gives depth, right? It tells the person, a review panel, a promotions panel, a teaching awards panel, it tells them a little bit about what you do and how. And now for those of you who've come along to the Advanced HE Fellowships, this is nothing new. You're across this because this is what I keep talking about all the time. This heuristic that I've presented to you can be used in many different contexts to talk about what you do and how. And that, I think we're all very good at doing that because it is something that's very front of mind for us. The next thing is you need to talk a little bit about why you do it. Why does Kushala lead in the way that she does? Why does Kushala choose to teach in the way that she does? Sometimes we are so focused on the what and the how that we forget the why. And a compelling account of practice should talk about the why, not in much great detail, but you need to articulate what is it that guides your particular way of operating, you know, of being, of teaching. The next part, the really important part is the so what. So you've been busy doing all these amazing things in learning and teaching and leadership, but how do you know it's been effective? Who's been impacted positively by this and what are the outcomes or results that you can see from your practice? So this is very much about saying, how have I impacted others and who have I impacted and in what ways? And this is again ones where you need to think about the sorts of data and evidence that you will use to help others understand that you are an impactful educator and leader in learning and teaching. So, and then finally, don't forget to talk about the what next, what now. So now you've done these things, what have you learned? What might you do next? So if you use this heuristic, what it helps you do is to go beyond that shopping list where you just list your achievements and activities without much depth. And this helps you really understand how can I add depth to the things that I've been doing. And then very quickly, don't forget to balance breadth with depth. So you need to use lots of examples across your various applications, but make sure that there's a good mix of examples. Make sure that you're using the right examples for the right areas of your application. And once again, there's no recipe approach. You've got to write, rewrite, throw out the draft, start again. You know, it's a longitudinal process of crafting your reflective account or your compelling account of practice. And then make sure that the examples align to the level that you're applying for. So if you're applying for example, an associate professor level in promotions, that would look very different to someone who is applying for promotion to level B. If you're applying for principal fellowship in Advanced HE, that would look very different to the person who's applying for fellowship. So again, context matters, and you need to be very acutely aware of those criteria that I shared with you before, and really align them to your examples. But once again, don't sacrifice depth for breadth, because there's nothing worse than a panel reading a laundry list or a shopping list of activities and achievements that don't have the depth. So make sure that you balance the depth and breadth. And then finally, every compelling account of practice makes use of data and evidence to back up the claims that are being made. So obviously your fellowship application, your teaching award, your promotions application is making a claim about you being an effective leader or educator. So what is the data that you're going to use? What are the examples and data that you're going to use to demonstrate to that panel that you are indeed effective and that you have influence, that you do have a positive impact? So at this point, here's a list of all the things that you can use. And I guess my point here is that this is what the panel will engage with to help them understand the so what question, you know? So how is this person impactful and in what ways? And I guess at this point, I will also acknowledge that you don't begin collecting this data at the point of applying. You actually do this as part of your practice as an educator. This is something, it's a continuous activity, and we all need to build up the habit of intentionally seeking out that data, of collating that data, of curating that data and engaging with that data, which I know that all of you do in the context of subject improvements, course improvements, and so forth. But you need to also collect data that's about you. So how can what is the data that tells the panel about the impact of my practices? And to use that data in a very intentional way when it comes to the point of crafting your fellowship application, your promotions application, your probation portfolio, and all those things. So let's, I think the tip here is to make sure that we are intentional in that space. So at this point, I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to hand over to our guests. But before we do that, is there any question or any front of mind reflection from anyone in the audience that you would like to share with us? No? Well, keep thinking about any questions you have, put them into the chat. And like I say, the best part of the session is going to be now hearing from Rachel, Jess, and Anna about how they've navigated this space. And I think the beauty of this is they give us an insider perspective to this process, right? This is a complex process. This is a complex space. And I think we're all going to be finding value in hearing from them about the things that they've done to navigate this space. So Rachel, can I invite you to come off mute and share your story? And Rachel is a senior lecturer in the School of Psychology. So welcome and thank you for being here, Rachel.
Thank you, and thank you for that very generous introduction. Lots of pressure now. I guess a couple of things. So the context that I'm speaking about, I went for promotion in 2023. And then last year applied for a teaching fellowship. So I think lots of people might do it the other way around because they're using the fellowship as justification for their promotion. But I think that there is something to be said for sort of scaffolding or sequencing some of these things off each other, because completing one process can definitely make the other one easier. And that was certainly the case for me. One, I guess, point of reflection as I was thinking about this in the lead up to this session today, I'm not sure if this is a gendered thing, but I certainly as a young academic found myself very sort of cast as a teaching academic. And I was certainly engaged with research, but I had a lot more insecurity about my research practice as an academic than I did about my practice as a scholar, as a teacher. And so I had collected a lot more evidence around research than I had around teaching, because I was insecure about one thing and not about the other. So I had a bit of a lead in to going for promotion, and I cannot echo Kashella's point around that lead in period, because that is when you I cannot echo it enough, I should say, because that is when you realize what gaps and what spaces you have. So as I started to prepare for promotion, I realized that I had this, quite a compelling kind of record as a teacher, but not anything like I hadn't bounced off a lot of awards or applied for different sort of external markers that would indicate that, because I wasn't really that fazed about that evidence, to be honest. But what I did have, and what I think was really useful and maybe useful to some of you as well, is often in academia, we are so focused on the practice and the day-to-day grind of what we're doing that question that Kashella raised around why you're doing what you're doing is not so clear-cut to you. For me, that was clear-cut. And the reason for that was because I had been doing quite a bit of teaching that was quite different to what is the standard in my discipline. And, I've heard accounts from other universities in particular where you hear very hierarchical accounts of how academics are engaging with their students. And I had been engaging for quite some time with what I guess you could say, and I spoke about this in my promotion application, is the pedagogy of discomfort. So this desire to use discomfort in the classroom in a very intentional kind of way to facilitate critical thinking, to facilitate problem solving and also active learning. So it's an approach that really does kind of challenge traditional power structures and tries to center collaborative learning experiences over more hierarchical teaching dynamics, with the express intent of allowing students to take control of their learning experience within a supportive and inclusive but very interactive learning environment. And it's easy to say that you're doing something like that. The words inclusivity and that kind of thing get thrown around a lot. But what that actually looks like in practice and how disruptive that actually is, is a bigger question. And this had been disruptive for me because I had had experiences of working with colleagues who are quite sort of perhaps a bit confronted, I think, in some respects by the way that I was engaging in teaching practice. And because I was doing things differently, I'd really had to think about why I was doing it that way. So I had quite a strong theoretical understanding of what I was doing. And so that was really useful going into the promotion process. I had not spent time sort of documenting external things that would validate that, but I had a really strong compass around why I was doing what I was doing. And I think if you are in the process of applying for promotion and you're thinking similarly to me, if you find yourself in a position where you feel as though the evidence that you have for your teaching practice is not as clear cut as the metrics for research, I think there's a much narrower set of metrics that generally get referred to when it comes to research practice. Teaching practice, per the slide that Kashella shared a second ago, contains, there's so many different ways of evidencing what it is that you're doing. And that came out for me in both the fellowship application and the promotion application. So I guess the saying, there's many roads to Rome, comes to mind when it comes to evidencing your teaching practice. And that was really critical for me. And so then in the fellowship process, I remember, Kashella, you said to us that, you need to think about this being about yourself. This is not about your teaching team. This is an application where you're writing about what you're doing. And you want to spend less words on the what and the how and more on the why. And those words really rang in my ears after we had sessions in preparation for this. And, it's quite common that people spend a lot of time listing examples of what their teaching practice looks like, but they don't really talk about the outcomes or the impact of what they're doing or why they were doing it to begin with. So those things really sort of stayed with me. And I think one of the really nice things about this is that, look, this is perhaps a slightly counterintuitive point to make, but I think it's perfectly reasonable sometimes to work backwards from practice and situate yourself in theory after the fact. In an ideal world, we all sit down and think about our pedagogical approach, and then we design our teaching practice around that. But I think what often happens in practice is the opposite, that we do what we do, and then we stop and we reflect, and then we are able to connect it to different pedagogical approaches and things like that. But I think that there's a kind of a process of working forwards and backwards from theory through to practice, and then from practice back up to theory. It can really strengthen both ends of the game. And I think one of the things that happened for me as a result of going through the promotion process was realizing, one of the key metrics we have access to, of course, is the subject evaluation data. And I had really strong subject evaluation data, but I had an issue with that data because of some of the data that we have around the limitations of that data, particularly when it comes to, any kind of academic who may have a minority, whether it's that they're a person of color, whether it's gender, whether it's sexuality. There are certain ways in which that data often does not provide an accurate picture of people's teaching practice. So even though I had quite strong data, I didn't lean into that very much in my promotion application, because I leaned into some of the more qualitative accounts that I had and emails from students and things like that. But because I felt that was more nuanced, but I was reluctant to include metrics of my teaching performance that don't actually fundamentally line up with what I think is valuable information about teaching practice. So look, that's, I guess, a few observations. I hope they're useful. But I would say, just on a broader point, when you have to think about your own practice, you are thinking about yourself, and all of us care about this work. And it's a really psychologically challenging thing to often write a promotion application or to write a fellowship application, because you are bouncing between two realities, the reality of how you often feel about yourself and your practice, and then what you're trying to put forward on paper. And it's confronting. And I had a lot of times where, you know, I would think to myself, well, I've done nothing compared to this person, or, you know, you have so much comparison that often comes in the process. And so for the year that I went for promotion, I think I was beset with so much insecurity and anxiety for so much of that year. And then recently I shared my application with someone who's in the process of considering going for promotion themselves. And then they read my application and sent me a message saying, this is the most intimidating thing I've ever read. And that was me when I, you know, so I think you will always be bouncing between those different sort of positions when it comes to documenting your practice. And while all of the different metrics are valuable, or a lot of them I think are valuable, and I loved the wheel that you shared before, Kashella, because it really makes me think about levels of influence that I'm often not very consciously aware of. I think there is something very beautiful about the grounds roots approach of thinking about your students and what their experiences are. So I found myself going out a lot and thinking about other metrics, but I always kind of returned back to the student experience, because I think that is really where the rubber hits the road a lot of the time. So that's a few observations. I'm happy to take questions. But yeah, I hope that's useful.
That's wonderful, Rachel. And we will have some time for shared questions after everyone. So please, if you have any comments or thoughts, please put them in the chat. But Rachel, a couple of really important points. I think the key point was how confronting this can be, and the imposter syndrome one can feel when you're looking at this application going, am I worthy as a leader? You know, often I think for us, especially in the leadership space, we can grapple with that. So thank you for talking about that. And I think the other point that I made a note of is it reminded me there's two things, right? There's logic in action, which is our teaching practice on a day-to-day basis. It's messy, it's iterative, we're reflecting and learning on the go, adapting on the go. Now, when we're writing our application, is logic reconstructed, right? This is where you're kind of putting that theoretical, pedagogical lens and kind of talking a bit more about the why, what drives me in this space. So I think that's a useful way to think about logic in action versus the logic reconstructed, which is where you're sitting down to construct a narrative around your practice. And I love the idea that, you know, you talked about a compass, you know, like you found that for you, pedagogy of discomfort was kind of the lens that you use. So that was a great example, and thank you for sharing. So now I'm going to move on to Jess Thiers, who's an Associate Head of School Staffing and Development in the School of Education. Jess, please talk us through your experience.
Yeah, hi everyone. So I received an AAUT award this year, which came off the back of an Executive Dean's Teaching Award. And to me, applying for both of them was quite an odd process. Rachel, I completely understand the imposter syndrome, because I struggle with that. I also came from a school teaching background before academia. So the idea of putting myself forward for something like that was a very odd feeling, because I think I always thought, well, my teaching just speaks for itself. But it was also, I thought, because my teaching is my strength, I was like, I need evidence that I'm doing my job and I'm doing it well. With the evidence gathering and that lead-in time, I actually had been collecting evidence since 2020 for the award that I put in, that I received at the start of this year. And I didn't start gathering the evidence for the award. Mine was a bit of a different lead-in, in that in my discipline, teacher education, I was seeing on the news all the time and feeling this pressure from schools of a massive teacher shortage crisis that not just our country, but the whole world is kind of in at the moment. And then couple that with the fact that we know that even teachers that graduate, quite a large majority of them leave the profession within 5 years. So for me, it was like, why is that happening? And what can I do to help retain teachers that once they leave us at the university, how do we make sure that they're staying in the profession? And a big part of that was their preparedness and their confidence and their efficacy. So I went about trying to, within one of my subjects, develop students' confidence, competence, and efficacy within the classroom. And so over time, I had this subject that I piloted, and then I got ethics approval. I got a grant to research part of it and things like that. So my evidence before this award was a 4-year lead in time. The big things that I learnt throughout this process is evidence comes in many different forms. So that's the first thing I'll say. When you start gathering, it's not just your SES reports, whilst that data is quite useful. It's also things like student emails. It's also things like if you're engaging with industry partners that are aware of what's going on in your teaching and they're commenting on it. I also had social media posts from students that had commented about things that we were doing that we could use. I also gathered data about my students and their employment post their time with me in that teaching. So there are more than just the obvious when it comes to gathering your evidence. That's the first thing I'll say. The other big thing that I learnt once I went from the Executive Dean's Teaching Award to the AAUT Award was how I actually presented the what, the how, the why. And Kashila was absolutely amazing throughout that process. And I would be almost embarrassed to show anyone my Executive Dean's teaching application now to compare it to the AAUT award, because my first application was very, very immature in its writing. And I have offered it to a colleague to show them the difference in how that process over time, working with other people, can really draw out your point that you're trying to get across. One of the biggest challenges I found was that I kept talking in education or teacher, not education as in university education, teacher education speak. So I kept presenting my what, my how, and my why to someone that I thought had all this assumed knowledge of what happens in schools. Like they were interested in the teacher shortage crisis and the implications and what teacher efficacy means and all of that kind of language that we use within the School of Education. And working with Kashila, and I would definitely say find someone that is not within your discipline. I would say even try to find someone that's not in your faculty, because they will read things and they will kind of go, oh, hang on a second, what do you mean by this? And it interrogates and it makes you also present it for all audiences, not just people with your expert knowledge. And if anyone, whether you're going for promotion, whether you're going for an award, whether you're going for a fellowship, I would highly recommend getting that critical friend that doesn't have your expert knowledge in your field. So that way you know, because a lot of the times I know with the AAUT and also with promotion, the person that reads that your story, and I call it my story because it is my story, it's my story of my teaching practice. The person that reads it, you could be teacher education and they could be engineering, or you could be engineering and they could be, vet science. So having someone else read it so that way you can really get to the crux of what you're trying to get across, I would say was probably the most invaluable thing that I had throughout it. And whilst I'd be highly embarrassed to do so, if any of you do want to ask, just so that way, because for me, I look back and I go, oh, I'm embarrassed by that first draft that I did for the AAUT. I think it would be like, if you want to see the difference in what it looked like to where it got to, it's like a kindergartner versus someone that's completing a PhD, honestly, the differences in them. And so that process with a critical friend, I would say, was probably the most valuable thing I had throughout all of it. And I think that's my time, isn't it, Kashila? So I'll stop there before
That's wonderful, and I'm sure all of you have so much more that you can say, but we are limited for time. But I think again, Jess, you really picked up on this idea of, be disciplined in gathering the evidence, which comes in many forms. But also, I think I was reminded on how each of us can be disciplined in giving feedback to colleagues about their impact, and I'm trying to practice that more mindfully in my own role. So not just thanks, that was great, amazing, but actually words that talk about the material impact a person has had either on my own practice, either for my team or for my colleagues and so forth. So I think there's something to be said about us becoming better at gathering, collecting the evidence, but also contributing to other people's evidence. And then find a friend. Absolutely. I think one of the key things you can do before you even commit pen to paper or even look at those frameworks, go and find yourself a critical friend, a supportive colleague who's going to be your cheerleader, your advocate, your, question, who will ask you questions, who will help you interrogate your writing. So wonderful advice there. And now, again, if you have questions for either Rachel or Jess, please put it in the chat. We'll have some time at the end, but I'm really happy to hand over to you now, Anna. Anna is an associate professor in spatial science in the School of Agricultural, Environmental and Vet Sciences. So thank you, Anna.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. Yeah, I do have some slides because I would forget everything. My memory is just the worst these days. And I just came out of 4 hours of teaching and they just made my brain completely hurt. So I think I would forget half of the things that I wanted to share with you today. So hopefully you can see, or you will see soon.
I can see the slides.
Yeah, I will just put it on.
Yep.
Presentation. Can you see that full screen now?
Wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah, so definitely some of the things that I've included here are going to align hopefully with what Rachel and Jess were saying. Perhaps one of the things that I want to highlight about myself is the fact that I come from a geospatial science discipline, which I don't know if you know what it is. Most people don't, so that's fine. I don't work for NASA, if that's what you're wondering. I'm not that smart. But what it meant was that when I came to CSU about 11 years ago, I didn't have any background in learning and teaching. And so I started just doing my teaching out of a gut feeling, really, and what I thought would be, the right way to go about it. And I suppose I'll just start my account of that by saying that in my case, the stage of my career really mattered to progress through the different applications, because I really felt that I was growing as I was compelled to address specific things, whether that was for a fellowship or for the promotion. So I did start with a fellowship. This was really early on. It was the first time that someone asked me about my teaching philosophy. I didn't even know that existed. Turns out I had one. It was really buried inside of me. So I pull out things like, I come from a family of teachers, actually. So going back to actually 1 century ago, we had someone in the family that was a schoolmaster. So my parents are teachers. I have an auntie that was a teacher as well. And so my sister is a teacher. So I suppose I follow on some genetics there. I don't know. But it was interesting to reflect on that and start building up the reasons for why do I really love my job, and why do I think it's important to make a bridge between what I research and what I teach. So that initial fellowship really gave me an opportunity for doing that. And I suppose at that stage, you don't have much evidence to show for. You probably, and if you come from a background like mine, like you never engage with learning and teaching research, you don't have much knowledge of the literature as well out there. So you might just want to focus on aspects of your teaching practice, and you start building up, starting discovering what literature is out there, and you start building up from there. And then from that point on, then I went on promotion, and that was a bit of already, it was easier for me to do this. Still very focused on what I had as evidence at that point, because I just have been focused on specific subjects. And so was basically an account of how my teaching practice had evolved throughout the 3 to 4 years that I was teaching. And so I had a bit of data to build on my account, but it was really when I got to promotion recently for associate professor and then also for the teaching awards that I've started exploring other aspects of that evidence. So basically, when you progress from a standpoint where you're just interested on evolving your teaching practice, if you go further on to getting promoted from level C to level D, and when you're presenting yourself in a teaching award, it's all about really the impact that you make. And I was just thinking about what Jess just said, getting that data and that evidence for impact is not something that will come straight away. It will come from these years of paying attention to what you're doing in class, paying attention to what people are saying about what you're doing in class, and taking note of what evidence is out there that you're actually making a change. Quite confronting, because you don't want to think of yourself as someone that is not able to create that change, right? But also you need to be always aware. And so I suppose if you really want to start writing about your practice, don't see it as this isolated event. It needs to be something that follows through your career. So actually how I get started, and I think this was common from what Rachel and Jess said as well, in terms of so important to talk to someone that has already done this, is familiar with what this means, and definitely someone outside of your discipline. You definitely want to go there. For me, it was incredibly important to have access to senior colleagues and mentors that throughout the way were able to point me to the right direction, or just simply giving me a critical evaluation of the work that I was doing. And sometimes you set yourself to go for this award or to go for the promotion, and these conversations ideally should happen really early on, so that you have time to understand what you're going to write about and what evidence might be useful for that. Also really helped me, and this is probably something that comes attached to my research disciplines. Like, we're all very objective and we're very factual in the things that we do. It's all about building algorithms and testing algorithms, sometimes a bit mechanical. So I do tend to apply that to the way I do things. I start by thinking what I want to say, and I'll write it down, and I have some bullet points to sort of like guide me, to make sure that I don't get lost in the process, right? And also, there's nothing worse than looking at an empty sheet of paper to start writing. So if you just start putting some bullet points there, that just gives you hope that you will get somewhere eventually. So I really like that approach of mapping out what I'm going to say, putting that down into bullet points. Also, scheduling dedicated time to do this work for me was extremely important. I'm sure that, like you, I have a lot of solicitations in between teaching, research, meetings, other things, life in general, right? So it seems like you never have time to think about this, right? So for me, it was really important to set up time in my calendar to start focusing on the things that I needed to do to apply for promotion or to apply for a teaching award. And that really helped me as well. In terms of data, yes, goes back to what Jess was saying. Not so much the subject evaluation surveys are really an excellent starting point, but these days you can also access to other types of data at the subject level. For example, say that one of the aspects that you want to highlight is how to compare the performance in your subject with performance of other subjects within the same discipline or across, so for example, first year. So you might want to use that data as well. You have access to assessment performance if you just want to focus on how the changes in assessment design, how that has changed throughout the years that you taught that subject, for example. So you can pick on that as well. What we call unsolicited feedback is so important. Posting discussion forum, emails. One thing that is important though is that it's just not, you're not after that email that says that you're great and they loved your class. It's not really about that. Is that really you're after the email that it says you made me learn because of this activity and this point that you make about this. This is when you see that the change is happening for them and there's the impact, right? Of course, we're all great and we all enjoy hearing everyone saying that we're great, but you want that feedback to be structured so that you can use it as your evidence. Also, when feedback is negative, or let's call it constructive maybe, and it's always hard for us because we put so much effort into the things that we do, but there's actually value in that type of feedback as well, because you might realize, oh, I thought this was working for everyone, but it might not be. And so instead of seeing that as a bad result or something that is not positive, you actually can build on that to reflect on what should I've done different, am I doing something that is not working? If so, what that is, and can I use that to showcase that I'm being reflective about it? Another issue that I had is because it was not related to my research was how do I start looking for literature out there that is related to my teaching practice? That was extremely hard for me because I was not familiar with the journals or, how do you search for the keywords, but also it took me some time to actually understand what the terminology meant and how could I link that to my teaching practice. And hence the importance of really starting early and working with people that are more familiar with this space to help you bridging, the way you do research with how to use those skills to actually be effective in understanding and thinking about learning and teaching research as well. So reflective practice as a geospatial scientist, this was not a skill that I had developed whatsoever. I was really strong in writing papers and scientific reports and technical reports. I never heard of reflective practice before joining CSU and start teaching. And so I really needed to train myself on that question. So what, what am I trying to achieve with this? What did I succeed? Was I successful? What can I learn from this as well was very important for me. And getting feedback from a group of people, that I think it's so important, and allow again that quality time for you to reflect on the feedback that you're given and incorporate that into your draft. So I suppose trying to summarize that in what I consider to be challenges and issues. So time constraint is probably a challenge that I have been battling throughout these 10 years at CSU. There's never seems to be a good time to write about these things. And however, it's so important that we do so. So having quality time to focus on this narrative, I think it's extremely important. We need to be careful with the data that we use. You want to make sure that your story doesn't get limited because you didn't have time to collect the data or you didn't think about that data beforehand. So I think it's really important that we pay some time and we pay attention to that aspect as well, thinking that it's quantitative data and qualitative data and the combination of the two that probably are going to help us to tell that story better. If you come from a similar background as myself, not having any contact with learning and teaching as a research discipline, so if this is not familiar, this can actually play against you. So you might need to have more time to understand actually the terminology, the way of thinking, the different frameworks. This is really important as well, particularly if you go into teaching awards, for example, where that linkage needs to be clear and needs to be clearly made. And also, the fact that we might not be ready or we might not be wanting to deeply engage with reflective thinking, I see that as a challenge and it can be an issue as well. So you definitely want to move away from a list of evidence without any personal character into it, right? So you want to make sure that if you read something that I've written, that's going to be different from something that Jess has written or Rachel has written, because we do put our DNA into that and that needs to be visible. And I think the only way we can really achieve that is through reflective thinking. And so some suggestions, not that, I think everyone has their own story, but definitely starting early if you're wanting to use that account for whatever it is, teaching award, promotion, important to start those conversations really early on. Being strategic with data, sometimes it really helps. Like I never had the time to actually set up a research project to collect the data that I needed to write my these accounts. And I felt that really might have limited me to some extent to be more successful than what I wanted to be with some of the awards. Engaging with literature, really, really important. So you're not doing this isolated. You belong to a research group and you need to find your place in that group. I think making that linkages is really important as well. So for me, it was not so much teaching in geospatial science, but it was about teaching STEM, and all the challenges that come with students that normally don't like studying STEM related subjects, so that was a challenge for me. So fitting myself into that framework was incredibly important. And I suppose the one that really works for me all the time is trusting the process. Yeah, of course, we do have imposter syndrome. I have it every day. If you work in geospatial science, you feel it even more because it's a very competitive field. But trusting the process, it might feel overwhelming at times, but with time and with work, I think you obviously will get something that you will be very proud and very happy with at the end. I think that's it. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Anna, for sharing that very compelling account of your journey in this space. I think the things I took away from you is that for all of us, developing a compelling account of our practice starts long before we actually apply for promotion, a teaching award, a fellowship, and so forth. So, you know, again, we talked about that. I think all three speakers, you know, that idea of being very intentional in creating the building blocks for creating that impactful account of practice. And I think, Anna, again, your narrative, you know, about colleagues who are in the sciences, who are practitioners, for whom this is a very unfamiliar genre and way of writing, you know. So again, this is where we say partner up with people who can support you and guide you and mentor you and coach you in this space, because it is a very different way of writing, and we need lots of work, you know. Jess, you talked about draft 1 through to draft 95. I think it felt like it, I'm sure for you.
For you, it felt
it-
worse because you kept getting them.
So, you know, it just takes that amount of time to get that story, to really create a story that others can access, that and really engage with and resonate with. So my thank yous, a huge thank you to you, Anna, Rachel, and Jess, for sharing your story so generously. And I hope that people will have lots of comments. There's lovely comments in the chat, so please have a look. I'm going to just post one thing, and for those of you who were at the session this morning around Gen AI, the world around us is changing, has changed, is going to change very rapidly. So it would be remiss of me not to mention the personal writing assistant now that we have all got, okay, in our everyday work, that we can engage with, lean into, and interact with as a bit of a thought partner. So once again, I'm sort of deep diving into the sustainability concerns, the other concerns, but I think for those of us who want to engage, we have a fabulous tool and a technology that can help support things like this. So for example, for me, I find it quite difficult because I don't have a science brain to do the mapping of application criteria to examples and so forth. So if I was going to do something like that now, I would absolutely be leaning into one of those tools to help me do some of that mapping, because that's not my area of strength. For some other people, it's very difficult to write in that active tone, to use the first person, because we're not trained to write in that way. We are trained to write mostly in a very impassive way, in a kind of third person way, in a very technical way. You talked about it, Anna. So if you need some help refining that tone, and I give lots of feedback of how to situate yourself in these applications, you know, you have a 24-hour, you have, you know, help 24 hours there for you to kind of interact with these tools and technologies to kind of get started on some of the basics. And another place that you can use Gen AI just to give you feedback is around the depth of your examples. I talked about depth, and of course the breadth of the examples you've got. So this is where we are. We have an opportunity to engage with these tools in processes like this as well, not just in our teaching, not just in our research, and not just in our kind of administrative work, but also in constructing compelling accounts of our practice. So on that note, I'm going to now hand it over to the floor. I know that some people are here and have questions and reflections. So please, can you share with us any questions that you might have, or any front of mind thinking that you might have been sort of doing as you listen to our fabulous speakers? Don't be shy.
Thank you, Kashila. Thank you, everyone. I just what I wanted to say is I wanted to thank the three ladies in terms of their honesty, and then share that during their application they have this imposter syndrome. You know, whether that's for whatever reason, and the growth of them through that experience is it's a very inspiring experience. And I did catch up with Jess. I'm looking forward to just learning more from Jess and the other two ladies. Yeah, thank you very much for
Yes.
sharing.
I agree, Meow. I think we have an incredibly kind and caring community at Charles Sturt. I think we've always talked about that pedagogy of, Yinjamara. I think our community lives that and shows that every day. I am incredibly, I'm just, when I think about the community, that generosity shines brightly to our students, to each other, and so forth. And absolutely, Jess, Rachel, and Anna are paying it forward, because that's what we do, right? We learn, we grow, we kind of, there are these achievements, and then we support other people in their journey. So this sharing is one example. They'll be having lots of conversations, no doubt, outside, mentoring others in this space as well. So yes, I agree with you. It's wonderful to have expertise like this amongst us, but also to know that they are sharing and sharing that forward. Any final thoughts? We've got 5 more minutes. I hope that this has been a really useful session. Actually, I think when I look at the comments in the chat, I think it's been fantastic to have that conversation. Like I say, there's no recipe approach for this, and each one of us in our own unique context will approach this in a different way. But just to hear how our 3 presenters have gone about this and to kind of share in some of their insights, their learnings, has been incredibly valuable. Anna, if you're happy to share your slides, we would welcome that, and you can put that into the chat. I think that would be really useful. And I will also share my slides in the chat, so you have immediate access to that. So everyone, all I can say is all the best for you as you engage in this process. Reach out to your colleagues, reach out to the Teaching Academy. If you need some support in this space, I can try and connect you up with people to support you. All the best to you as you construct your compelling account of your practice and impact in learning and teaching. Take care, everyone. It's wonderful having your company. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Sheila, for organizing this.
Yeah,
Thank
really
you.
appreciated.
Bye.